She stood at the front of the military courtroom, the frost from outside still clinging to her uniform's shoulders. Commander Harper Lane faced the rows of brass and metals without blinking. Colonel Riggs's words cut through the air like a blade. "You didn't follow orders, Commander. You're a disgrace to the uniform." What happened next made even the most seasoned officers lean forward. Harper stepped closer to the microphone, her voice steady as stone, and spoke a name and unit that should never have been uttered in public. The room froze. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story moves you, subscribe for more untold military stories of courage, loyalty, and the fight for truth. The winter air at Fort Rainier, Washington, had a way of cutting straight to the bone. That morning, the cold was dry, sharp, laced with a low, creeping fog that clung to the chain-link fences and security gates. Beyond the perimeter, the jagged silhouette of Mount Rainier loomed like a silent sentinel, its snow-capped peak hidden behind a veil of clouds. The entire military court complex was shrouded in this icy stillness, as if the base itself was holding its breath. Inside the oak-paneled chamber of the Fort Rainier Military Court, the air was warmer but far from comfortable. Every polished brass fixture gleamed under fluorescent lights, reflecting the rigid formality of the place. The wooden benches were filled with uniformed personnel, each whispering in low tones until the gavel's sharp crack silenced them. Commander Harper Lane sat at the defendant's table, posture flawless, chin lifted in quiet defiance. She was 39, tall and broad-shouldered from decades of intense training, her movements deliberate, controlled. Her dark hair was pulled back into a perfect regulation bun, revealing a face weathered by years of deployments, high cheekbones, a faint scar along her left temple, eyes the color of steel that had seen both victories and losses no report could fully convey. Harper carried herself with the unshakable calm of a combat leader, but her presence radiated a different weight this morning, the burden of being judged by those who had never been where she had stood. Her dress blues were immaculate, each ribbon and medal forming a precise, colorful constellation across her chest. Some were for valor in combat, others for missions the public would never know about. She rested her hands lightly on the table, her right thumb unconsciously tracing a rough scar along the inside of her left palm. A private ritual she did whenever the past pressed too heavily against the present. The prosecution's lead, Colonel Mason Riggs, stepped into the center of the courtroom. Riggs was in his mid-50s, his once black hair now peppered with gray, cropped in a military cut that emphasized the square shape of his jaw. His uniform bore its own impressive row of commendations, though many had been earned from a desk. Tall, lean, and rigid as the rifles in a drill team, Riggs was known for his sharp tongue and a belief in absolute obedience to the chain of command. Once, years ago, he had served alongside Harper on a joint operation. That shared history didn't soften the gleam in his eyes now. It only made the betrayal of this courtroom feel sharper. Riggs wasted no time. He tapped a control, and the screens mounted along the chamber walls flickered to life, showing grainy footage from Operation Iron Harbor, a mission still classified in most details. It was recorded in the ghostly greens and grays of night vision, a compound, a target zone, shapes moving fast across rooftops and alleys. Over the footage, the clipped chatter of military comms cut through the silence. Eagle 1, this is command. Proceed to strike. Negative. Civilians in the target zone, came Harper's voice, calm but firm. This is a direct order, Commander Lane. Execute immediately. With respect, sir. Cannot comply. I request mission abort. The feed ended. Riggs turned to face the judge, then the gallery, letting the silence stretch until it became a weight pressing against everyone in the room. This, Riggs said, his voice cold as the morning outside, is not just disobedience. This is the breakdown of military order. Commander Lane did not simply hesitate. She refused, directly and repeatedly, an order in an active operation. All eyes shifted to Harper. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. There were civilians there, she said evenly, her tone devoid of theatrics. That fact did not change just because it was inconvenient to acknowledge. Murmurs rippled through the back rows until the judge raised a hand for silence. Far from the base, in a quiet stretch of road outside the small town of Rainier, Sarah Connors sat in the worn armchair of her modest farmhouse living room. Sarah was 41, of medium height but slim and wiry, with the kind of endurance built from years of tending to others. Her light brown hair was pulled back loosely, and her face bore the faint lines of someone who smiled often despite the weight of her memories. She had served as a Navy medic for over a decade before leaving the service to care for her ailing mother, who had passed the year before. The loss had left her quieter, more watchful, as though she now measured the world in moments worth protecting. On the braided rug at her feet lay Copper, a 7-year-old German shepherd, sable and black with a graying muzzle, his frame still strong, though his eyes were clouded over. Around his head, a neatly tied orange blindfold rested comfortably, both a necessity for his light sensitivity and a badge of his resilience. Copper had been a K-9 service dog in the Navy, trained for search and rescue and explosives detection. He had served alongside Harper on multiple missions and had once saved her life by dragging her out from under collapsed debris during a compound breach. The injuries from that day had stolen his sight, but not his sharp hearing or keen sense of the world around him. The television flickered with the local news broadcast, a grainy photo of Harper in uniform filling the screen as the reporter summarized the trial. Copper's ears twitched, a low growl built in his throat, his muscles tensing. He rose to his feet, head turning toward the front door, as if he'd caught a scent or sound far away. Sarah looked down at him, frowning. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, but Copper's attention remained locked on something unseen beyond the walls. She followed his gaze, if it could be called that, to the corner of the room, where an old metal storage trunk sat tucked against the wall. It had been there for years, sent from the base shortly after Harper's last deployment. Sarah had never opened it fully, only storing it as she'd been asked. Copper moved toward the trunk, his nose brushing against the latch. He gave a short, insistent bark, then turned his head toward Sarah, as if urging her to do something about it. On the TV, the reporter's voice droned on. Harper Lane faces potential dismissal and loss of benefits if convicted. Sarah knelt beside the trunk, her fingers brushing away the thin layer of dust. The latch clicked open, revealing the cold surface of a smaller metal case inside, its edges dented, its lock still intact. She didn't know what it contained, but as she glanced at Copper, standing guard over it, ears pricked despite his blindness, Sarah felt the quiet shift of something important beginning to stir. Back at Fort Rainier, Riggs pressed on, circling Harper like a hawk. "Commander Lane," he said, "the rules of engagement do not supersede a direct order in active combat. You know this as well as anyone. Why did you think you knew better than the chain of command?" Harper's gaze was steady, unyielding. "Because, Colonel, the facts on the ground changed, and because sometimes the right thing to do is not the easy thing to explain afterward." The room was silent, save for the quiet scratch of the court reporter's pen. Outside, the fog still clung to the base, thick and unmoving, as though the day itself refused to clear until the truth did. Colonel Mason Riggs stood in the center of the Fort Rainier courtroom, the air thick with tension that even the hum of the fluorescent lights couldn't cut through. He pressed a button on the control panel, and the screens along the chamber walls came alive once more. The voices that emerged were crisp, clinical, the kind that carried weight far beyond their words. "Eagle 1, this is command. Proceed immediately." "Negative. Civilians in the target zone," came Harper Lane's voice. Calm, deliberate, the kind of calm forged in fire. "This is a direct order. Cannot comply. Request mission abort." Riggs turned sharply toward the bench, his expression sharpening into something almost predatory. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is not valor. It is hesitation. This is not humanitarian instinct. It is weakness dressed in the language of morality." From the defendant's table, Harper's posture remained perfect. Her gaze met his without so much as a blink. "That's not weakness, Colonel," she said evenly. "That's professional ethics. I won't trade the lives of civilians for a piece of metal on my chest." The quiet conviction in her voice was enough to make a few officers in the gallery shift uncomfortably. At the prosecution's table, an assistant leaned over to Riggs and whispered something. The assistant, Second Lieutenant Andrea Cole, was a fresh-faced woman in her late 20s, her blonde hair pulled tight into a bun, uniform immaculate, eyes flicking nervously between her superior and the defendant. Her role was minor, but her eagerness to please Riggs radiated in every small movement. Riggs straightened and continued, pacing slowly as if to trap Harper in the rhythm of his questioning. "Commander Lane, how many missions have you led?" 22. "How many successful?" "All of them, by the only standard that matters, bringing my team home alive." He smirked faintly. "And yet, here we are." The judge, Rear Admiral William Hawthorne, watched over the exchange with the same stone-faced authority he had projected since the first day. In his late 50s, with silver hair combed neatly back and a frame still broad from his days in uniform, Hawthorne's voice carried the gravelly edge of command experience. Few noticed the faint tightening of his jaw when Harper spoke, except Harper herself. Far from the courtroom, Sarah Connors was in her small kitchen, her breath held as she fitted the tiny silver key she'd found in the lining of the old trunk into the lock of the metal case. The click sounded louder than she expected in the quiet house. She glanced at Copper, who sat by the table, his head tilted slightly under the orange blindfold, as if he knew what she was about to find. Inside the case lay a single black flash drive, labeled in small, precise handwriting. "Iron Harbor, eyes only." The words made her stomach knot. She plugged it into her old laptop and clicked on the lone audio file. A voice came through, low, deliberate, male, and unfamiliar. "Adjust target coordinates by 2 clicks west. Civilian presence confirmed. Proceed regardless." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She replayed the line 3 times, each repetition stoking the slow burn of outrage in her chest. Whoever this voice belonged to had knowingly overridden warnings about civilians. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice. Copper shifted, rising to his feet. His paws tapped softly on the worn hardwood as he moved toward the back door, pausing only to look back in Sarah's direction. "What is it, boy?" she murmured. But instead of barking, he padded purposefully toward the garage. Sarah followed, the crisp air biting at her skin as she stepped into the dim space. Copper stopped at a large steel tool chest pushed against the far wall. He began pawing at the bottom drawer, claws scraping against metal. "You're going to scratch the paint," she chided softly, but knelt down anyway. When she pulled the drawer open, she found a rolled-up, laminated map. Spreading it across the workbench, Sarah recognized it instantly, a detailed layout of a coastal compound, annotated in Harper's unmistakable block lettering. Certain areas were circled in red, and beside them, handwritten notes. "Non-combatants reported here. Evacuation point. Delay assault. Verify civilian clearance." Sarah sat back, exhaling. Between the recording and this map, she was looking at proof that Harper's refusal was grounded in fact, not insubordination. But proof against whom? She didn't know who the voice on the recording belonged to, but she had a sick feeling the answer was closer to the courtroom than anyone realized. Back at Fort Rainier, Riggs was closing his questioning with a final barb. "So, you believe your personal moral compass outweighs the orders of your commanding officers and the objectives of the United States Navy?" "I believe," Harper replied, her voice low but carrying, "that the integrity of our service is measured not just by the battles we win, but by the lives we choose not to take." A ripple of silence moved through the gallery. Hawthorne adjusted his glasses, tapping his pen against the bench. Riggs opened his mouth to press further, but the judge lifted a hand. "That will be enough for now, Colonel." Harper returned to her seat, her face as composed as when she had entered the room. But in her eyes, steel gray, steady, there was the faintest flicker of something that could have been relief, or anticipation. Miles away, Sarah closed the map, tucking it and the flash drive into the inside pocket of her jacket. Copper settled at her feet, his head resting on his paws, his breathing slow and even. She reached down, stroking the thick fur behind his ears. "Looks like we've got work to do, partner," she whispered. Outside, the sky over Rainier was the color of cold iron, and in both the courtroom and the little farmhouse garage, the weight of what had been uncovered hung heavy, an unspoken understanding that the events of this day were only the beginning. The morning fog had thickened since the trial began, curling low over the rooftops of Fort Rainier and dimming the winter light that slipped through the high courtroom windows. The air inside was tense, heavy with the faint smell of polished wood and starched uniforms. Every creak of the benches, every faint shuffle of boots on the floor seemed magnified in the silence that had settled after Colonel Riggs concluded his last line of questioning. Commander Harper Lane sat with her back straight, her hands folded neatly on the table, but her gaze was locked not on Riggs nor the judge, but on the microphone in front of her. The metal stem caught the pale light like a blade. She inhaled slowly, the kind of breath she had taken before breaching a hostile compound, and lifted her eyes to the bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice even, "I request permission to fully identify myself for the record." Rear Admiral William Hawthorne, his silver hair immaculate and his dark blue uniform creased to perfection, gave her a puzzled look. "Commander, your name and rank are already established in these proceedings." "Not all of it, sir," Harper replied. There was an edge beneath the composure now, a quiet steel. "May I approach?" Hawthorne hesitated for the briefest moment, then gestured with 2 fingers. "Proceed." Harper stepped up to the microphone. She didn't raise her voice, but the room seemed to lean in, as if the walls themselves were listening. "Night Vulture, 2016 to 2019, Task Force Echo." The effect was immediate and electric. In the gallery, a Navy captain in the second row went pale, his hand tightening on the armrest. A brigadier general in the corner reached for his phone, murmuring urgently into it. 2 men in civilian suits, Pentagon observers, exchanged a glance that was more like a silent alarm. Hawthorne's composure cracked. His lips pressed into a thin line as a shadow of recognition crossed his face. He adjusted his glasses, but his eyes stayed fixed on Harper as though trying to read her intentions before she spoke again. Harper said nothing more. She stepped back, allowing the weight of those words, those 2 identifiers that should never have been spoken in public, to settle over the room. Task Force Echo was a ghost unit, the kind of command whispered about in secure hallways and never acknowledged in official reports. On the other side of the country road, Sarah Connors was gripping the steering wheel of her aging blue pickup truck so tightly her knuckles were white. Copper sat beside her on the passenger seat, his orange blindfold in place, his ears flicking toward every sound outside. Sarah's jacket was zipped to her chin, the inner pocket heavy with the flash drive and folded map. She had made her decision an hour earlier. She couldn't keep the evidence to herself. Her contact was a man named Miles Keegan, a former Marine turned freelance investigative journalist now living out of a battered camper van parked behind a cafe in downtown Rainier. Keegan was in his early 40s, thick-set with a close-cropped beard, a faded leather jacket, and a sharp, restless intelligence that made him both respected and disliked in equal measure. His reporting had exposed procurement fraud at a Navy shipyard 2 years ago, earning him enemies in high places. Sarah's plan was to hand the data to Keegan, who could get it into the right hands without being silenced by the military's chain of command. But as she turned off the highway into the narrower streets leading toward town, she caught sight of a black SUV in her rearview mirror. It stayed 3 car lengths behind through 2 turns. Her heart thudded. "We've got company, Copper," she muttered. The dog lifted his head, ears sharp, body leaning slightly toward the door, as if ready to spring. She took a side street, hoping to shake them. The SUV followed. When she pulled into the alley behind the cafe, the vehicle slowed but didn't enter. 2 men stepped out instead, dark coats, sunglasses despite the overcast sky. They began walking toward her. "Out," she whispered, pushing open her door. Copper jumped down, his paws clicking on the damp pavement. Sarah slipped the flash drive into her jeans pocket and turned toward a narrow gap between 2 brick buildings. Copper moved first. His nose swept the air, then he trotted toward the gap, body tense. Sarah followed, her boots crunching on scattered gravel. The alley narrowed until the walls almost touched her shoulders, the light dimming. Behind them, footsteps quickened. Copper wheeled suddenly, planting himself between Sarah and the approaching men. His fur bristled, and a deep, resonant bark erupted from his chest, echoing off the brick. The sound was enough to halt the men's advance. One lifted a hand in mock surrender, while the other glanced toward the street. Sarah took the chance. She backed farther down the passage, keeping one hand on the wall and the other near Copper's shoulder. The dog didn't move until the men muttered something and turned back toward the SUV. When they were gone, Sarah's breath came fast. She knelt, pressing her forehead briefly to Copper's. "Good boy," she whispered. His tail gave a single, slow wag. By the time they reached the cafe's back door, Keegan was already outside, leaning against the wall with a paper cup of coffee in hand. He eyed Sarah's expression and the way Copper stayed glued to her side. "Trouble?" "Just the wrong kind of attention," Sarah said, pulling the flash drive from her pocket. "You still have contacts inside Fort Rainier?" Keegan's brows rose as he took the drive. "Enough to get this to someone who will listen, and to make sure it doesn't vanish into a shredder." Back in the courtroom, the ripple effect of Harper's whisper continued. Hawthorne called for a brief recess, but no one in the gallery moved right away. Conversations hummed in urgent, clipped tones. A Navy commander exited to take a call, his voice low but sharp. Riggs sat stiffly at the prosecution table, his jaw working as if he were grinding down words he didn't dare say aloud. Harper returned to her seat, her attorney leaning in. "What just happened?" he murmured. "They remember who I am," she said quietly. And that, she knew, was just the first move. The fourth morning of the trial dawned brittle and bright, sunlight glinting off the frost-silvered railings that lined the walkway into the Fort Rainier military court. The cold air seemed sharper than usual, as if the weather itself sensed the day would cut through pretenses. Inside, the mood was taut. The gallery was filled to capacity, every seat taken by officers in pressed uniforms, a scattering of civilians in dark suits, and members of the press with cameras discreetly poised. Commander Harper Lane sat at the defense table, her eyes scanning the room with the measured calm of someone trained to assess every angle before moving. She wore her dress blues, the medals on her chest a quiet reminder of years lived in shadowed operations. Her attorney, Major Franklin Wyatt, a lean man in his 40s with a perpetual air of guarded optimism, leaned close. "Something's different today," he murmured. Before Harper could answer, the double doors at the back swung open. Rear Admiral Jocelyn Reeve stepped inside, a tall, striking woman in her early 60s, her short silver hair cut with precision, her Navy uniform immaculate. Her presence carried an unspoken authority. She was the Pentagon's direct representative, and her arrival was enough to still even the whispers in the gallery. A clerk approached the bench, carrying a sealed envelope and a small black case. "Your Honor, we have received evidence marked as urgent priority, hand-delivered from an external source vetted by military intelligence." The judge, William Hawthorne, adjusted his glasses, but his hand trembled slightly as he took the envelope. The bailiff opened the case and set a laptop on the evidence table. The screen lit up with a satellite image of the Iron Harbor target zone, time-stamped and tagged with coordinates. A side-by-side overlay showed the original mission coordinates, circled in green, and the altered ones in red. The shift was subtle but devastating. The red zone directly overlapped a civilian cluster. Major Wyatt stood. "Play the accompanying audio." From the speakers, a low male voice issued precise instructions. "Adjust target coordinates by 2 clicks west. Civilian presence confirmed. Proceed regardless." The gallery murmured, but then another document appeared on screen, an authorization sheet bearing a signature. Wyatt stepped forward, his voice cutting clear. "This is the final approval for the coordinate change, signed by none other than Judge William Hawthorne when he served as legal counsel to the Oversight Committee 3 years ago." The room went still, Hawthorne's face drained of color. "This is highly irregular," he began, but Admiral Reeve rose from her seat. "It is highly criminal," she said, her tone slicing through the tension. She glanced to the bailiff. "This proceeding is hereby terminated under direct order from the Joint Chiefs. Judge Hawthorne, you are relieved of your duties and will be taken into custody pending formal charges." 2 naval security officers stepped forward, their expressions blank, their movements precise. They guided Hawthorne away from the bench. His once commanding posture sagged as the doors closed behind him. Harper sat very still, her gaze following the scene with no visible triumph, only the quiet acknowledgement of a truth exposed. Outside, in the crisp midday air, reporters surged forward as the crowd spilled from the courtroom steps. Among them, Sarah Connors stood with Copper at her side, the German shepherd's orange blindfold catching the winter light. Sarah's frame was lean, her posture protective, as if shielding Copper from the jostle of the crowd. Harper emerged, the press surging toward her, questions hurled like pebbles. Copper's ears pricked, his nose lifting toward her. Then, with sudden certainty, he moved, pulling Sarah forward through the crush. The dog stopped just in front of Harper, lifting his head to sniff along her sleeve, her hand the hem of her coat. It was the deliberate recognition of a soldier greeting a comrade. Sarah's eyes met Harper's. "He remembers," she said simply, her voice carrying over the noise. For a moment, the chaos of the press line faded. Harper knelt, her hand finding the thick fur along Copper's neck. The dog stilled, settling at her feet as though taking up his old post once more. Cameras flashed, capturing the image. The decorated commander, the loyal K-9, the silent bond forged in the unspoken moments of war. By the time Harper straightened, the crowd had quieted, drawn into the gravity of the scene. Even her former teammates, gathered off to one side, stood with their shoulders squared a little higher. Copper remained at her feet, unbothered by the attention, embodying a loyalty that didn't care for courts or politics, only the truth of the people it belonged to. The day after the trial's dramatic conclusion, Fort Rainier seemed quieter, the winter sun spilling over its snow-dusted parade grounds in a soft, golden light. Inside the command conference room, the air was warm, but thick with anticipation. Commander Harper Lane stood at the head of a long oak table, her posture as straight as ever, the morning light catching the shine of her dress blues. Across from her sat Rear Admiral Jocelyn Reeve, whose sharp silver hair and steady gaze spoke of decades of unflinching service. On the table between them lay 3 folders. Reeve tapped the first with a neatly manicured finger. Option 1, honorable discharge, full pension, your record amended to reflect commendations earned. You walk away clean today. She moved to the second. Option 2, immediate retirement with all benefits intact, no further duties. You keep your dignity, your privacy. Her hand rested on the third folder for a moment before sliding it forward. Option 3, reinstatement. You'll command a new rapid response unit under my direct authority. No committees, no buried orders. You pick your own people. You run your own operations, but you'll answer directly to me. Harper looked at the folders without opening them. Her steel gray eyes flicked up to meet Reeves. If I take the third option, I choose my team, I have direct comms to you at all times, and one more condition. Copper is part of the unit, not a mascot, a member. Reeves' lips curved into the faintest smile. The German shepherd? The one who guarded you on the courthouse steps? Harper nodded. He's more than a guard dog. He's already served. He knows the stakes. Reeve leaned back, considering. Done. And for your medic? Sarah Connors, Harper said without hesitation. Former Navy medic, field experience, proven loyalty. Minutes later, Sarah was walking up the front steps of the command building, the brisk wind tugging at her dark green parka. Her light brown hair was loose today, framing a face that looked both cautious and curious. She had barely slept since the verdict, torn between the relief of Harper's vindication and the uncertainty of what came next. Copper padded beside her, the orange blindfold vivid against his sable and black fur, his pace steady, as if he already knew where he was going. Inside, a young ensign in neatly pressed khakis greeted her with a clipboard. Ms. Connors, right this way. Commander Lane is expecting you. Sarah found Harper waiting in a smaller adjoining room. The commander's formal posture softened slightly at the sight of Copper. Good to see you both. How's he doing? Ready for whatever comes next, Sarah said, resting her hand on Copper's neck. Harper's gaze moved between them, then back to Sarah. I want you as our unit's medic. We'll be going into places where lives hang by a thread, sometimes ours, sometimes civilians. I trust you to keep both safe. Sarah hesitated only a moment before nodding. I'm in. Later that afternoon, Harper, Sarah, and Copper stood in a cavernous supply hangar being repurposed for the new unit. A quartermaster, with weathered hands and a brisk efficiency, introduced himself simply as Chief Warrant Officer Lou Brennan, a barrel-chested man in his late 50s with a voice like gravel and a soft spot for working dogs. Brennan crouched to Copper's level, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he buckled a custom-fitted tactical vest over the dog's shoulders. On one side, a patch bore Copper's name in bold block letters. This vest is reinforced for shrapnel and light ballistics, Brennan explained. And here, he tapped a small compartment on the side. Space for first aid supplies or tracking gear. He's part of the team now. Sarah ran her fingers over the patch, then glanced at Harper. "Looks official to me." The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions. Harper met with candidates for her team, each with their own history, skills, and scars. There was Sergeant Leo McKinney, a wiry demolitions expert with a quick grin and tattoos winding up both forearms. Lieutenant Dana Cross, a tall, composed intel officer whose analytical mind had kept more than one mission from going bad. And Chief Petty Officer Elias Hawk Hawthorne, no relation to the disgraced judge, a broad-shouldered helicopter pilot with a calm, steady drawl. Harper assessed each with the practiced eye of a commander, building more than a roster. She was building trust. By evening, the team gathered at the training grounds on the far side of the base. The wind carried the sound of the flag flapping high above, its colors stark against the pale winter sky. Harper stood at the front, Sarah at her right, Copper at her left. The dog sitting tall despite his blindness, head lifted toward the sound of voices. "This unit exists for one reason," Harper said, her voice carrying in the cold air. "To protect those who cannot protect themselves, soldier or civilian. We don't take shortcuts. We don't look away. We operate with precision, with honor, and with the understanding that every life saved matters." She looked down at Copper briefly, then back at the team. "Everyone here has a reason to be standing on this line, and from this day forward, we stand together." The group broke into nods and quiet affirmations. Sarah rested a hand on Copper's vest. The dog's tail gave a slow wag, as though sealing the unspoken pact. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the training grounds in amber light, Harper, Sarah, and Copper walked toward the hangar that would serve as their headquarters. Behind them, the American flag snapped in the wind, a bright and constant reminder of the values they carried into every mission. Ahead, the hangar doors stood open, the first shadows of evening creeping across the floor. But inside was the hum of preparation, the quiet clatter of gear being readied, and the promise of work that would matter. The three of them crossed the threshold together, the dog's paws silent on the concrete, Sarah's boots steady beside Harper's polished shoes. Whatever waited beyond this beginning, they would meet it as one, commander, medic, and a K-9 whose loyalty had already been tested in fire. In the end, Harper's story reminds us that courage is not just found on the battlefield. Sometimes it is the quiet, steadfast choice to do what is right, even when the world tells you to look the other way. The loyalty of Copper, the faithfulness of Sarah, and the strength of a mission built on honor are living proof that miracles still happen in our time. I believe those miracles come from God, who sees the truth when others try to hide it, and who gives strength to those who protect the innocent. In our everyday lives, we may not stand in a courtroom or lead a special operations team, but we all face moments where we must choose integrity over convenience, compassion over selfishness. In those moments, remember that God is with you, guiding your steps, just as He guided Harper, Sarah, and Copper. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment below and tell us what this lesson means to you. Subscribe for more stories of courage, faith, and redemption. And as we close this chapter, let us pray for God's protection over all who watch this video. If you believe in the power of truth and divine protection, write Amen in the comments.